Hello, I'm Renee Bucciarelli. 1970 was the year that Colebrook, New Hampshire celebrated its 200th birthday, and the party went on all summer long, culminating in a historical pageant that took place in late August. I was a little kid living just up the street on Colby Street, caught up in all the excitement as my mom and her sisters, the Fannin sisters, worked closely with the author and the artistic director, Ellsworth Bunnell. This pageant was truly a remarkable community event. Just about everybody in the town was involved in some way. A year later, Bunnell published his script as a book called Even to This Valley. 50 years later, during this pandemic, we would like to honor the memory of this really vibrant time in Colebrook's history. It's amazing now to think that one person, Doc Gifford, narrated the entire 2 hours of Bunnell's sometimes opinionated and often very humorous script. Here, now, we are lucky to have two of the original production team members with us reading, my Aunt Patty Fannin Kleinfelter and Rob Owen, along with others of us who were either youngsters on the stage in 1970 or were in the audience watching our parents and neighbors in the spotlight. We hope you enjoy the memories.
Hello, I am Rob Owen, and I was born and raised in Colebrook. Also, as a theater major at the University of New Hampshire, I designed and built the stage for the original pageant production as a theater project.
I'm Patricia Kleinfelter, and I was privileged to be a part of the Bicentennial and a part of Ellsworth Bunnell's book. I did the backdrops. I didn't build them, but I did some painting on them, and I was very happy to be a part of it with my two sisters, Paula and Peggy.
Hello, friends. I hope this finds you well. My name is Charlie Corliss, and my mother, Paula Corliss, was the director of the original version of what you're about to see.
Hi, I'm Terry Rosei. My family, a longtime residents of Colebrook. I have lived here just about my whole life, with the exception of a couple of stints in the military and at college. And I'm a retiree of the Colebrook school system, so I'm very much a part of this community just about my entire life.
I'm Katie Kruger Sullivan. I'm the daughter of Pam Hicks Kruger and the granddaughter of Parker and Janet Hicks. I have been to Colebrook every year since 1976, and I'm now here with my son, Cole Sullivan, and Chloe Sullivan. Cole is named for Colebrook and many of the ideals that are in Mr. Bunnell's narrative we're reading today.
Hi, I'm Pam Hicks Kruger, and I grew up in Colebrook, New Hampshire as well. This bicentennial celebration is very near and dear to me because I was a member of the last high school class, the year 1970, when we did our bicentennial celebration.
My name is Gary Hicks. I graduated from Colebrook Academy in 1971. My claim to fame as to the Academy is that I have twice given the commencement address at the graduation.
Hi, I'm David Collins. I was born and raised in Colebrook, New Hampshire, and I actually graduated from Colebrook Academy in 1989. I was born after the bicentennial celebration. However, from a young man, I always had a great passion for history, and it's so wonderful to be here now with you all, celebrating this wonderful bicentennial pageant.
I'm Lucille Sutton. I grew up in Colebrook, New Hampshire, Colebrook Academy class of 1963. I left at the age of 18 to go away to college and have always lived in cities, but my heart is in Colebrook.
My name is Amy Bucciarelli-Felker. My connection to the Colebrook Bicentennial Pageant is I was one of the school children, and I am honored to be part of the Fannin sisters' legacy and related to our current producer, Renee.
Hello, this is Les Kleinfelter, longtime resident of the area. The part that I will be reading is Running Through the Rye. It deals with the Prohibition era in Colebrook And it kind of has a special meaning to me because I worked for many years as an immigration inspector on the border.
Hi, my name is Steve Bissonette. I'm a native of Colebrook, New Hampshire. I grew up on Colby Street in the shadow of Mount Monadnock, where I always dreamed of living when I grew up. Instead, here I am in Whitefield.
Hello, I'm Deanne Parker Hicks, and I'm blessed to be the son of the late Janet Louise Brakel Hicks and the even later Parker Alba Hicks Jr. I'm class of 1980 at Colebrook Academy, and I make a point of appearing in this pageant once every 50 years, so I'll see you in 2070.
Even to This Valley by Ellsworth Bunnell. Introduction. It seems to me that any historical pageant worth its salt must not only provide history in easily assimilated doses, but should also include drama and social commentary. Therefore, in writing this pageant for the Colebrook, New Hampshire Bicentennial Celebration, I have not dwelt on the fires, floods, epidemics, and other natural disasters that can visit a town over a period of 200 years. Instead, I have accented the social history of Colebrook, the beneficial effects produced by such institutions as education, trade, travel, and communication, along with the disasters wrought by wars, women's rights, prohibition, and the other calamities which, while blighting an otherwise beautiful country, nevertheless left their own indelible stamps on the soul of mankind. If, as the French philosopher Descartes believed that all things work together for good, then even these fungi on the body politic have wrought their own miracles, and we should rise up and call them blessed. Be that as it may, the thing that pleased me most about this pageant was the fact that the entire thing, from inception to final lights out, was homegrown. It was bred and born in North Country soil. It was brought to maturity and fruition through the efforts of North Country residents. It has been impossible for me to personally thank everyone who helped make this production an outstanding success. I shall try to do so here. I must begin with my director, Paula Fannin Bucciarelli Corliss, whose abilities to cope with people and situations kept the production mobile and dramatic. To her sister, Patty Fannin Hughes Kleinfelter, my thanks for her artistic talent, whose painted backdrops, etched like Currier and Ives prints, were visual delights. I especially doff my hat to Robert Owen, a most versatile young man who in a matter of days created from nowhere a 150-foot panoramic stage complete with lighting and special effects. Dr. William H. Gifford, as narrator, gave these words a brilliant and mellifluous reading with the theatrical timing and wit he is so capable of. Peggy Fannin McCarney, another of the trio of talented Fannin sisters, served as soloist, adding meaning to the drama with her gifted singing. Stuart Frizzell and Jack Kelly, gentlemen of fine musical endowments and endless ability, rounded out the offstage elements of the pageant. Lastly, I tender my appreciation to all those kind, patient, and community-minded folks who donned costumes and served as actors to reenact the lives of our ancestors. To all of you, my friends and neighbors, who did so much to make the Colebrook Bicentennial, and particularly the pageant, the success that it was, I offer my deepest gratitude. E.H. Bunnell, Colebrook, New Hampshire, February 2nd, 1971.
Prologue. The name of the town is Colebrook, its county is Coos, its state is New Hampshire, and its country is the United States of America, Western Hemisphere, planet Earth. As you can see by looking around you, it's a rugged land, rugged in its broad-shouldered mountains and its up-thrusting strata, yet at the same time, it's a lovely land. The mountains are verdant with tall trees, our fields are lush with the grass and flowers of summer, and our streams sparkle with the zest of pure waters. In this land of ours, change does not come quickly. It steals upon us softly and subtly as the changing seasons come, creeping up the valley, gently surrounding us and altering our lives. The landscape is altered, a little here, a little there, until our destinies have been shaped in new ways, cast in new molds to meet the challenge of changing times. Unfortunately, perhaps, very few great moments of history have occurred here. To the sorrow of the historian, the great tides that transformed men and nations merely rippled our quiet backwater and changed our physical appearance hardly at all. No, then, as now, Colebrook was a town with a difference, a personality all of its own. When we choose to be inconspicuous, we could be very inconspicuous. And that's what generally happens most of the time. We find it pays to mind one's own business. With that in mind, we invite you to see this, a pageant of our years, brought to you in a series of 12 episodes.
Episode 1, The Amarants.
Our history must begin with the Indians, the Abenakis of St. Francis, Quebec, the Coashakis of northern New Hampshire, the Penobscots of Maine, and the Pequawkets of southern New Hampshire, with their various subdivisions, were all part of the great Algonquin nation, rulers of all New England and Canada.
The central metropolis of this nation was the large Abenaki village of St. Francis, a name bestowed upon the town by the French who settled along the St. Lawrence River. After the French came up with the bounty system for English scalps, St. Francis and its Abenaki branch of the Algonquin nation became a real threat to the settlers of New Hampshire.
Mrs. Johnson, writing her famous narrative of the raid on Fort Number 4, now Charleston, New Hampshire, tells us that shortly after her arrival at St. Francis, a troop of warriors paraded through the town, flourishing freshly lifted scalps on long poles. And it is well known that when Rogers Rangers raided and burned the village, more than 600 of these macabre trophies were found on exhibit.
Despite the ferocious doings of their cousins to the north, I can find little evidence that New Hampshire's Coashakis took great part in sports of this nature.
Although the Coashakis must have resented, and with reason, the coming of the white man, axe on shoulder, leaving burned and broken forests in his wake, only relatively minor clashes seem to have occurred between these forbearing Indians and the pale faces.
Nevertheless, the burning of St. Francis put fear of the white man's god and gunpowder into the hearts of the Coashakis, and for several years, they left the Cohos for the deep woods to the north.
But with the onset of the American Revolution, all eyes turned toward Boston, and the lure of their old lands brought many Coashakis back to northern New Hampshire, headed by Chief Captain Joe and his brother, Captain John. Casting their lots with the settlers against the English king, they became scouts for the Revolutionary forces.
After Chief Captain Joe met his death in Newbury, Vermont, where he is buried in Oxbow Cemetery, the mantle of chieftain fell to his brother, John. John headed up a party of his fellow tribesmen, and for services rendered to the colonial forces, was awarded a captain's commission. He also lies buried in the lower Cohos, some distance from his home campfire, but left a son to carry on as chief. This son, known to settlers, to Daniel Webster, to Lord Ashburton, and sundry historians as King Philip, saw clearly the approaching end of red man's domination of the Cohos, and in order to secure a measure of peace for himself and his people, he gave to a party of settlers on June 8, 1796, the now famous King Philip's deed.
His deed conveyed the entire Cohos country and a goodly slice of Maine to the whites. In return, he received the privilege of planting 4 bushels of corn and wheat annually, the right of his tribe to hunt and fish, and sufficient clothing for himself and his wife. Just think of giving up so much and getting so little in return.
This deed opened a whole Pandora's box of after effects that became the woe of the white man. For this deed formed the basis of the Indian Stream Republic, the border raids, and finally the establishment of the international boundary between New Hampshire and Canada through the treaty negotiated by Great Britain's Lord Ashburton and New Hampshire's own Daniel Webster. But that is another story for another time.
Now we must concern ourselves with the last Indian chief of New Hampshire, Metallic, son of King Philip. Very little of Metallic's ancestral domain was left when he assumed the title of chief of the remaining Cohashakis. Many had been absorbed by other tribes to the north and never returned to the Cohas. The remnants of Metallic's tribe were ill-equipped to live in the white man's world, under white man's laws, where an Indian couldn't get an even break.
To the Indian, the land, the game, the woods, and the campfire belonged to everyone. They found it hard to believe the white man when he said, "This land is mine. Don't hunt, don't fish, don't camp, don't build your fire." Who could live under such laws?
On the other hand, the memory of the bloody massacre was still green in the minds of the whites. As a matter of fact, the whites so feared an Indian uprising during the War of 1812 that they built a fort on high ground in Stewartstown. And to this day, that high ground is known as Fort Hill. In other words, the whites just didn't want the Indians around.
Doubtlessly, the settlers would have run Metallic and his minions out of the Cohas if they could have gotten away with it. But if their land titles were to stand up, they had to let their copper-hued brethren hunt and fish, for King Philip's deed had been duly recorded in the Grafton County records.
Metallic found himself a wife named Molly, married her in the white man's fashion, gathered his remaining people, and set up a stamping ground on a hill just east of Colebrook Village, near a pleasant little river. Settlers moving in from Massachusetts brought tales of the fierce Mohawks with them. To these people, these new people, all Indians were Mohawks. Since there were Indians on the pretty little river, it was immediately dubbed the Mohawk. And the Mohawk River, it has always remained.
In his own quiet way, Metallic tried bravely to be his people's true leader in this new and confusing world. But the white man's ways and diseases proved just too much to bear up under. One by one, the wigwams were folded and the Indians stole away to better hunting grounds, either in Canada or the sky, as the case may be. Finally left alone, Metallic and Molly, New Hampshire's last native rulers, resumed a nomadic life, wandering back and forth over their old domain, living as their ancestors had lived, mostly by hunting and fishing, trading furs for clothing when they needed to. They wandered over the old Indian trails from Colebrook to Indian Stream, through Dixville Notch, along the McGalloway River, around the shores of a Magog Lake and back again. Nomads with no oasis of friendship, no people, no home, but still they couldn't bring themselves to leave the lands of their ancestors.
The years passed and they grew older. In the mid-1830s, Metallic, for the last time, performed the burial rites of his people and laid Molly to rest near a huge boulder on Umbagog Lake's shore. Ever since, the landmark has borne the name Molly's Rock.
Metallic continued his wandering alone, up and down, ever older, ever more tired, grieving for a lost loved one, a lost nation, a lost world. When his blindness came about, he was deep in the woods and alone. With stoicism and a will to live that few young men could match, he made his way back to the white man's world, stumbling for days in a black nightmare before reaching human habitation, nearly dead of starvation and exhaustion.
It dawned on local authorities that he would have to be provided for as a public charge. It was the custom of towns to farm their indigents out to the care of whomever would do the job for the lowest price. Metallic's struggle had brought him within the confines of Stewartstown, and since no other town wanted him, he was there bid off by Howard Blodgett for $48.25. The final degradation of an hereditary chieftain by the usurpers of a land that was once owned, root and branch, by his people.
Metallic died the next year and was laid to rest, not beside his Molly as he might have wished, but in an unmarked grave in a corner of the old North Hill Cemetery in Stewartstown. Many years later, a newspaperman and one-time Boston Globe reporter, John Emerson, interested himself in Metallic's story, verified the location of the grave, and erected thereon a dignified stone inscribed in plain block letters, Metallic.
Metallic's tribal name is the basis of our county name, Coas. Lower Richardson Lake in Maine is still called by the natives Mollychunkamunk Lake. Two ponds in the Galloway River are called Metallics Ponds, and a certain variety of chub in these waters are known as metallic strangers.
Metallic lifted his hand against no man. The wisdom of nature was his. The bones in his pauper's grave are important bones, for they are the bones of the last sachem that New Hampshire will ever have.
Episode 2, The Early Settlers. As early as 1752, Governor Wentworth sent a party of men into the northern Coas for the express purpose of mapping and surveying future land grants. This party was headed by the legendary ranger, Major Robert Rogers, and had Stephen Sparhawk as surveyor. In 1755, Major Rogers returned to Northumberland and built Fort Wentworth, the Fort Wentworth that was to loom so large in the retreat of Rogers' Rangers from the attack on St. Francis. During these times, a few traders and trappers, both English and French, crisscrossed this territory and held commerce. It is fairly well established that two of Rogers' Rangers during the retreat from St. Francis came down the Indian Stream and the Connecticut River Valley. As early as 1768, a trading post was in operation in Stratford, but generally the white man as a settler did not appear until after the granting of the 3 townships. These townships were granted by Governor Benning Wentworth on December 1st, 1770, to Sir George Colebrook, Sir James Cockburn, and John Stewarts, all of London, England, and to John Nelson of Grenada, British West Indies. The names of 3 of these grantees are preserved in the names of the towns, Colebrook, Stewartstown, and Columbia, whose name until 1811 remained Cockburn. There is nothing to mark the memory of the 4th grantee. Needless to say, none of the grantees came to take personal control of his lands. Unrest against the mother country was even then being felt throughout the colonies, and they no doubt preferred to remain under the comforting protection of the Union Jack. Since no agents for the grantees were ever appointed, it remained for the first settlers to make squatters' claims. That is to say, they merely staked out a piece of land and called it their own. The first settler to make his home in the northern townships was Abel Lannard, who, well before the Revolution, brought his wife and 2 young sons from Windham, Connecticut, to his log cabin 1/2 mile below the present Columbia Covered Bridge, and settled down to the life of a pioneer. The second permanent resident of the area also settled in Columbia, a retired major of cavalry named Dennison. During the years prior to the Revolution, several others staked out lands for settlement, perhaps the most important being Captain Abijah Lannard, who in 1775 served as representative for the entire North Country. He too had come from Connecticut to settle in Columbia. The population figures for 1775 gave Columbia 14 inhabitants and Colebrook 4. However, fear of Indians and the unrest of approaching rebellion prevented much true settlement until after the war. Mrs. Lannard, alone, had the fortitude to remain in her home in spite of the solitude and dangers. Even though her husband died of fever when the eldest of their 2 sons was only 9 years old, this valiant woman clung to her home and kept a fire glowing in her hearth. Once during the war years, while the 2 Lannard boys were boiling maple sap in an iron kettle, they were captured by Indians and taken to Quebec. The mother somehow managed to get word of the abduction to her uncle, Colonel Webb, who was then on George Washington's staff. Colonel Webb, working through official channels, finally managed to secure the release of the boys. For 9 years, this courageous woman lived in her cabin alone, without once seeing another woman. Finally, hearing that white families had returned to Stratford, she made her sons take her there so that she might speak with another woman. With the close of the Revolution, those who had previously staked out claims came back to the North Country to renew their titles and start new lives. Just who was the first permanent settler in Colebrook is not clear, but it is a matter of record that by 1786, a man named Jim Hugh had rolled up a log cabin on the land behind what was later known as the George Gleason place. And Luther Chandler had a log cabin where Ruth Walker's home now stands. Others followed, including Hezekiah Parsons, who with his wife and 5 sons moved to Colebrook in 1789. Another son, born to the Parsons in 1793, was probably the first white child born within the borders of Colebrook Township. By 1790, many people had settled in the area. By 1800, Columbia was the largest town in the northern Coos. And in 1803, when Coos County was created, nearly became the county seat. And yet, when the first United States Census was made in 1790, Columbia was credited with only having 26 souls within its borders. Colebrook, on the other hand, lists 29 inhabitants, with 7 heads of families, namely David Hicks, Abijah Lannard, James Lannard, Andrew McAllister, William McAllister, Roswell Merrill, and Moses Smith. The McAllister brothers left an enduring monument to the town in the form of the beautiful old White Tavern on North Main Street, presently owned and occupied by Mrs. Leah Gadwa. The McAllisters, with Moses Smith, were among the petitioners for incorporation. Building a tax structure, laying out roads, and confirming property lines, to say nothing of appointing town officers and obtaining some representation in Concord, was impossible without first becoming a corporate whole. So in 1795, 11 citizens put their signatures to a petition for incorporation. The petition was granted in 1796. The town, as we know it today, began to take shape. In 1790, a mill had been erected on Sim Stream in the Columbia Valley, and this early source of sawed lumber contributed to the rapid building of some of the fine old homes that are still to be found in our town. Due to the rapid resurgence of manufactured goods after the close of the Revolutionary War, our people were spared some of the rigors with which the earliest settlers had had to cope. To be sure, for many years, cooking was done at the kitchen fireplace, but the fireplace was well made from locally fired brick. The winters then, as now, were often bitterly cold, but there was no dearth of good firewood. For the inner man, there was a plenitude of more or less potable potato whiskey, and for the fortunate few, an occasional tot of bona fide molasses rum. Almost the only obstacle that prevented the niceties of downstate civilization from reaching Colebrook was the lack of a highway between us and the outside world. The Reverend Timothy Dwight, in 1803, wrote that while the roads in Cockburn, Colebrook, and Stewart were dry and firm, those in Stratford and Point South were impassable. Most roads were practically non-existent, and transportation was by horseback, or what could be dragged behind teams of oxen. It seemed logical that since Portland was the nearest commercial center of Colebrook, our trade should be aimed in that direction. That direction meant following the ancient trail of Chief Metallic and his ancestors through the rugged confines of Dixville Notch to the Androscoggin Valley. In 1805, the town fathers again put their signatures to a petition to hold a lottery to raise funds for a road passable by both wagon and sled. Permission was granted and the lottery held, with disappointing financial results. The downstate plutocrats had little knowledge and even less interest in this last wild section of New Hampshire. The people of Northern Coos were bitterly disappointed, but refusing to accept defeat, gave their time, their oxen, and additional taxes to the task of building a road to the outside world. The road, still locally known as the Old Coos Trail, was opened in 1811. It probably wasn't much of a road by modern standards, but it was a road over which an ox cart could pass without falling apart, and it was rather a monumental task for its time. And best of all, Colebrook was never isolated again. The Old Coos Trail now is a part of Route 26 and is commemorated by a handsome bronze plaque erected near the entrance to the Colebrook Country Club.
The coming of education. New England has always held education in high esteem, perhaps because many of the early colonists were graduates of Oxford University, or perhaps because Harvard, Yale, and Dartmouth set the pace for general education early. Again, Colebrook was fortunate in that its early pioneers had received at least a primary education of the 3 R's from the already well-established schools of Lower New England. Many of our settlers were very well educated and desirous that their children receive the same advantage. The first schoolhouse in the town was erected in 1795 on the land now occupied by the American Legion. It was constructed of logs and had none of the refinements of these days that are considered mere necessities. One can picture what the place must have looked like. A squat, square building, improperly lighted, window glass being a precious commodity in those days, heated by a huge fireplace, without whose comfort, heat, the children could not have endured the rigors of the winter term. The seats were long handmade benches, and of desks there were none. The students of whatever age practiced their reading and writing on slates they held in their laps. They learned to read from whatever books they could bring from home. It would be another 40 years before the Numbered Readers, published by William Holmes McGuffey, would bring a measure of equality to the education of rural America's youth. And the slate as an educational tool was to linger on even into the 20th century. Nevertheless, the young people of the town managed to secure an education, and for this, great thanks must be given to the teachers. Although it is doubtful that many, if any, had looked at school teaching as a means of earning a living when they saw the need, they took time out from the task of building a town and helped to open the minds of the youngsters. A case in point might be Captain Benjamin Buell, the maternal grandfather of Governor Chester B. Jordan. Captain Buell came to Colebrook from Connecticut in 1803. Although he had been a military man, he was scholarly, of excellent character and refined tastes, and an elegant penman. For many winters, he was a highly prized teacher in Colebrook. Unfortunately, he died 10 years before the birth of his illustrious grandson. As the town grew, so did the number of schoolhouses. Colebrook's Academy was chartered in 1832. Unfortunately, this did not mean that funds were immediately available to build with. For years, a party of civic leaders led by Hezekiah Parsons sought aid from the state legislature. Finally, in 1846, the state granted 10,000 acres of virgin timberland in the Indian Stream Territory to the fledgling school. It is interesting to note that to build the original Academy building, the entire 10,000 acre tract, which today would be worth millions, was marketed for 25 cents an acre for a total of $2,500. As before stated, teachers were drawn from the local population. Any young man or woman who had reached a reasonable proficiency in reading, writing, and the doing of sums in his turn became a teacher in the ever-expanding school system of the town. As the town grew, each newly settled section was provided with its little rural school, and the parents of children attending that particular school were expected to provide food and lodging for the teacher who boarded round, as it was called, and taught the young during the 2, sometimes 3 terms that comprised the school year. One very early teacher, the future Mrs. Hazen Bedell, received 50 cents a week for her duties, and yet managed to save enough to purchase silver for her family. Of course, there were certain fringe benefits. Probably 80% of the teachers, both men and women, met their future spouses while boarding around. The business of school teacher marriage has never departed from us, and to this day, in some of our areas, the young ladies who come to us fresh from college remain to settle down as the bride of some local swain. Yes, the rural schools of our fathers will remain a fond memory of Colebrook heritage, where, in spite of many difficulties, education was dispensed with determination and patience, and where discipline was maintained with the aid of a birch switch.
Episode 4, The Rise of Trade. Colebrook is a town that even during the worst of times has managed to face the world with a reasonable, robust facade. There is simple reason why this is so. For one thing, Colebrook has never been a boom town. Gold was never discovered in our stream beds. No great factory ever moved in upon us to pollute our air and our river and to dominate our population with its paternalism and its wrath. We didn't even mushroom at the trailhead or along the right-of-way of some now forgotten railroad. No, ours was not a Topsy-like growth. Ours, thank heaven, was a slow, deliberate, well-organized increase in stature, founded on a sound economy and a prudent belief that not only all that glittered was not gold, but also that slow and steady would win the race. I am sure that in the past 200 years, this philosophy has galled some of our citizens, those who sought the end of the rainbow in the middle of Main Street, and those who wished to lift their eyes to the firmament and behold a begriming smokestack. But steadier and more cautious heads prevailed, and I think the end result has proven them to be correct. Of course, we have had industries. Almost everything that would prove of use to our ancestors of a century ago had at one time or another been manufactured within the borders of the town. We have had sawmills, grist mills, cotton mills, woolen mills, brick kilns, starch factories, cheese factories, iron foundries, a furniture factory, shops for making doors, window sashes, blinds, and heaven knows what else, including, so that man might not lack one of his greatest necessities, at least 2 distilleries for the manufacture of whiskey. But, as has been previously noted, these industries were catering to the needs of a small area. It was never intended that their output be made available to the world at large. Such a thing would have been impossible in any event, with traveling conditions being what they were in those days.
These early factories turned out utilitarian products, their stoves, their shingles, and their ladder-back chairs, to fill the needs of a somewhat isolated area. And they did their work well, as can be seen by viewing such of their products that still survive. And yet, with only one major exception, these early manufacturers made money, in some cases a lot of money for those times. This investment of capital and ready employment was rapidly apparent in the expansion of our town and the solid financial worth of our citizens. The major exception of which I speak was the firm of Pratt and Smith. John Smith, a resident of Hartford, Connecticut, had acquired the deeds to 5 lots of land along the Mohawk River around the year of 1800. In seeking to develop his properties in this growing North Country, he secured as a partner the services of one Samuel Pratt of Marshfield, Vermont. Smith supplied the land and the necessary cash, while Pratt was to furnish the know-how and the labor in clearing the land into farms and erecting buildings thereupon. To this end, they bound themselves to a 5-year agreement dated at Hartford, Connecticut, February 10, 1809, at the end of which time the property would be split 50-50. Pratt came to Colebrook that same year, wresting farmland from the wilderness. To use their timber in the building of proper houses, they erected a sawmill. This proving successful, the ambitious pair built a cotton factory in 1813 and soon after added a store to their holdings. By this time, things were going so well that, like the Russians, they entered on another 5-year plan. This included the building of an even bigger store at the corner of Main and Pleasant Streets. A bit later, they bought the McAllister Mills at the foot of Cooper Hill and financed the digging of a tunnel and channel from the Mohawk River to provide additional water for these mills.
Despite the cold winter of 1816, which cost them the loss of 40 acres of wheat, among other things, the firm prospered and continued to branch out. The first real disaster occurred in 1820 when the cotton mill burned to the ground. They immediately rebuilt, this time with brick kilned on a neighboring farm. This new mill opened as a woolen mill and under various owners carded and wove wool for over 60 years. By 1814, Smith and Pratt had invested $54,000 in the town of Colebrook and were among the town's most prominent men. However, the building of the woolen mill seems to have been an overextension of their ready resources, and they fell into the coils of the Tremont Bank in Boston. The harassments and ruinous interest rates imposed by this institution were too much to cope with. In 1826, Smith and Pratt went into bankruptcy. Yes, the partnership had disappeared, but the memory of its passing is still visible today. The many thousands of dollars they spent here did much to lift the economy of Colebrook off the ground. As the town's largest employers, they induced many people to settle here and provided them with a means of livelihood.
They donated the land on which was built the Congregational Church. They gave a lot of land to the Colebrook Village Cemetery, thereby greatly increasing its size, and the channel they ordered dug from the Mohawk to Beaver Brook is still bisecting the 4th and 5th fairways of the Colebrook Country Club. But these, after all, are only material things. It is my belief that the most important legacy they left to the town was a state of mind. The collapse of this seemingly invincible firm must have shaken the town to its roots and would certainly have been an object lesson of the highest order. One can almost hear the inhabitants of the town of Colebrook forever after warning themselves and their children never to try to grow too big too quickly, never to commit themselves beyond their ability, and most cardinal sin of all, never to put all their eggs in one basket. We continued to look forward, adhering strictly to the old New England axiom that it is all right to play with your interest, but never touch your principal. This method of thought was so effective that in 1886, when the Coos County history was published, Colebrook was described as the wealthiest town per capita in the state. This was still true in 1938, when the book Let Me Show You New Hampshire was published, and I don't believe the situation has changed. Due to our unique geographical location, we are the only town in the United States whose banks, professional men, and merchants daily serve the residents of 3 states, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, plus the province of Quebec in Canada. As such, we have been fairly immune to recessions, depressions, and panics, and to the alarming results sometimes suffered by factory closures, the passing of the railroad, and similar calamities. We have built slowly and carefully with results that please us mightily. We are content.
Although small factories came and went, the real backbone of our growth as a town was the small businessman, the merchant, the harness maker, the cooper, the farmer, and the lumberman. The country store of the last century was the social club of its day. Here checkers were played. Here boy had a chance to oogle girl, and vice versa. Here the old timers sat around the stove and told each other how the youth of the day were driving the whole country to perdition. The country store was also a legislature in miniature, for politics were argued constantly, pro and con, and town meetings were often cut and dried before the local polls ever opened. Our stores today are very much changed in appearance, but their spirit remains the same. The stove and the checkerboard are gone, but the friendly atmosphere is still there. It is a place where politics are still argued out across the counter, and a place where you can actually get trusted for a new hat on Saturday night. I sincerely hope that our town never gets so big and our stores so huge that we lose this communion, this personal friendliness between shopkeeper and customer that we have so long enjoyed.
Episode 5, The Exodus to Beloit. Tucked away on Spring Street is a rather unimpressive looking house. Yet once it stood on Main Street as one of the fine houses of early Colebrook. Two events make this house especially notable. The first, it was the birthplace of a famous editor and author. Second, it was the birthplace of a part of the great American dream of expansion. For here in its front parlor, with its deep-set windows and interesting corner cupboard, was formed the New England Emigrating Company. In 1836, when these events were taking place, Colebrook as a village was a bustling community, already some 50 years old. The house was the property of Dr. Horace White, an up-and-coming young physician, and his wife, a former Bedford, New Hampshire native. These were stirring times in New England. George Washington was 37 years dead. Andrew Jackson was in the White House, and the young nation was feeling its oats. Abraham Lincoln was the young 27-year-old lawyer out in Illinois, and the voices of the abolitionists were beginning to be heard. Over in Vermont, even louder and uglier voices were driving John Humphrey Noyes and his perfectionists over into Oneida, New York. The far-off country of Texas was declaring its independence, and so too was a much smaller country, only 15 miles to the north, a country carved out of northern New Hampshire and southern Quebec, and known as the Indian Stream Republic. Yes, New England was getting overcrowded. Every day, people from the east were joining the westward movement. Dr. White was one of these men. He had a fine home in Colebrook and a well-established medical practice. His son and namesake, Horace White Jr., had been born in 1824, and another son was on the way. And yet, he was captivated by the stories of Western opportunities that came drifting back from those who were already on the scene. Oh yes, Colebrook men were already settling in Illinois. An uncle of Robert Crane was building houses in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Charles Messer was a trader with the Potawatomi Indians, and young Harvey Bundy was clerking in the Rockford, Illinois trading post of George Goodhue, one-time member of the provincial parliament from Sherbrooke, Quebec. From these and other sources came back word of unlimited land and potential riches to be garnered for practically nothing. And so one night in October 1836, in the candlelit parlor of Dr. White's house on Main Street, 12 men gathered to form the New England Emigrating Company. Dr. White, the guiding genius, was elected agent for the company to go west and find a suitable location for purchase and settlement. The company agreed to buy him a horse and sleigh, pay his expenses, and give him $100 a month for his services. Thus was a new city financed. Dr. White prepared to leave, closing out his practice and sending his pregnant wife back to her people in Bedford to await both the stork and the founding of the new colony. Before Dr. White could get underway, two younger members of the company, Robert Crane and Otis Bicknell, eager to see the West for themselves, set out in a two-horse wagon, arriving at Ann Arbor in late November. There they paused, helping Crane's uncle to build a house, until Dr. White joined them on January 16, 1837. The doctor had traveled all the way by sleigh, taking a northern route above the Great Lakes and crossing over at Detroit, possibly pausing there to view the remains of an old fort once commanded by another New Hampshire man, Major Robert Rogers. Taking young Bicknell with him, Dr. White searched out a fine stretch of land just over the border in the Wisconsin Territory, where the Turtle River flows into the Rock River. This lush piece of prairie, once the land of Indian mound builders, had been taken over by a French-Canadian trapper named Joseph Thibault. In 1836, a pioneer named Caleb Blodgett, native of Vermont, had appeared on the scene, liked what he saw, and purchased from Thibault for a mere $200, some 20,000 acres. Not a bad bargain, even for those days. Blodgett, with his sons, built a double log cabin and proposed the erection of a sawmill on the river. The prospect of plentiful sawed lumber for building helped Dr. White reach his decision, and he purchased for $2,500 7,000 acres of Blodgett's claim. Of this land, 1 square mile was set aside for their town, and the rest was divided among the members of the company. As soon as Dr. White arrived back in Colebrook with the news, the exodus began and continued until the new town, which had been named Beloit, was well established. Beloit has continued to grow until it is today a city of considerable size and beauty. Many other families from New Hampshire cast their lots with the pioneers and settled in Beloit. At least 6 families from Mrs. White's hometown of Bedford, New Hampshire, were early settlers of the new town, as was ex-president of the Indian Stream Republic, Luther Parker, and his family. These Colebrook people took with them their ideals, their religion, and their love of learning. The Monadnock Congregational Church, the only established church in Colebrook at the time, gave its departing members letters of dismissal and permission to continue worship in the new land. Within 5 years, the pioneers had built a new stone church, the finest in all Wisconsin at the time. And this in turn led to good schools and, in 1847, the establishment of Beloit College. Yes, the families that joined the migration from Colebrook were a fine, forward-looking group, and many of their offspring were brilliant men. Young Horace White, 3 years old at the time of the Exodus, graduated from the new Beloit College at the ripe old age of 19, and when only 24, traveled with Lincoln and Douglas, writing of their famous debates as the only authorized representative of the press. His intimate knowledge of Lincoln and politics did him no harm later when he became editor of the Chicago Tribune, and afterwards of the New York Evening Post. He also wrote erudite books on money and banking, and biographies of such people as Lyman Trumbull. Another Colebrook boy, James Mills Bundy, barely a year old when his father, David Bundy, signed papers as one of the original 12 in White's parlor, was equally noted. Having graduated from both Beloit College and Harvard University Law School, he became drama and music editor of the New York Evening Post and eventually editor-in-chief of the New York Evening Mail. Among other works, he wrote a definitive biography of President Garfield. Together on the Post, and later on as rival editors, these two men with their identical backgrounds must have enjoyed reminiscences about their younger days. Perhaps they also got together with that other noted editor and former New Hampshireman, Horace Greeley. Or maybe not, since Greeley was a Democrat. Young Robert Crane, who paused in Ann Arbor to help his uncle build a house, got married and sired a son, Ellery, who eventually returned to New England to become a noted Massachusetts legislator and historian. Also not to be forgotten is President Parker's son, barely 6 years old when his father headed the minuscule Indian Stream Republic. This boy survived the trip west, grew up, and became Lieutenant Governor of Wisconsin. There were, of course, others of greater or lesser importance, but all, you may be sure, were fine, sturdy folk, and the good New Hampshire ideals and common sense that they took with them to Beloit have survived in that city to this very day. In 1936, during the centennial of Beloit, a bronze plaque was sent from the Beloit Congregational Church to the Mother Church in Colebrook in memory of those who left here to found the first church of Beloit. Thus were the old ties strengthened and kept alive for the generations to come.
Episode 6, the Civil War. The military history of Colebrook goes back to the very beginning of the town. The earliest explorers and settlers were veterans of the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. Subsequently, men from this area served in the War of 1812, the so-called Appleby War, the Indian Stream War, and the Mexican War.
After this, the prospect of other wars being fought grew somewhat remote, and the bearing of arms was restricted to an annual muster day. It must be noted that maneuvers of these days were restricted to a few posturings with whatever hardware was nearest at hand, and the dragging about of the town cannon, an ancient piece of muzzle-loading artillery, which years later blew up on Lombard's Hill on one 4th of July morning.
No, the annual musters were mostly an excuse to drink quantities of local potato whiskey, pontificate on the godliness of abolitionists, soundly damn the pussyfooting of Franklin Pierce, and eat huge chunks of Mrs. Stevens' muster day cake.
However, although the military languished, militancy did not. The speeches of such abolitionists as Frederick Douglass and James Buffum were widely quoted, both in church and general store. The published sermons of Wendell Phillips and Henry Ward Beecher were accepted as the word of God himself.
The deepest feelings of all New Hampshire people, perhaps, were engendered by the singing Hutchinson family of Milford, New Hampshire. We were enormously proud of this, the most popular singing group of its time, and the fame it had brought to New Hampshire with songs like The Mountaineer, The Great Stone Face. Now, this singing family had become the darlings of the anti-slavery forces and brought fire and determination to abolition meetings with songs like Get Off the Track and The Slave's Appeal.
It is difficult for us today to get as caught up in the emotionalism of a cause to the same extent as did our great-grandparents. The songs of today do not stir us overly much, and a contemporary perusal of Uncle Tom's Cabin allows us a superior smile at the naivete of its prose. But in another day, the emotions of an entire country were stirred, rent asunder, and reached a terrible peak, where the fate of the United States as such hung on the success or failure of Colonel Pickett's cavalry charge in a Gettysburg apple orchard.
With all the posturing and bombast, Colebrook, as indeed all New Hampshire and the country at large, had made no preparations when in April 1861, Fort Moultrie fell to the guns of Charleston. New Hampshire had 3 major generals, 6 brigadier generals, and no troops at all.
It became a time to put up or shut up. A recruiting office for Coos County was opened in Lancaster on April 16, 1861, in charge of Henry O. Kent. From all over the country, a wave of patriotic men descended on the office, and within 2 days, the first quota of volunteers was filled. This group included the above-mentioned Henry Kent, who left the recruiting office in charge of a subordinate and went marching off to Bull Run with his friends.
They came from all walks of life, these men, the farm, the town, the river, and the mill. Some were fired by patriotism, some by the plight of a race, and some were in search of adventure. But for whatever reason, they kissed their loved ones goodbye and marched bravely away, unaware or uncaring that many of their number were already marked for death, and that the four horsemen of the apocalypse would leave hoofprints on each and every one.
The youth of our town left their loved ones with light hearts and confidence that a few short months would serve to put the world to rights. Instead, it was to take 4 long years.
Perhaps the life of the Civil War soldier was best expressed in a song written by a young New Hampshireman and made famous by the singing Hutchinsons. The young man was Walter Kittredge, native of Reed's Ferry, New Hampshire. The name of the song was Tenting Tonight.
At last, it was 1865, and April was a mingled chime of joy and sadness. For within weeks, both the Great Rebellion and the Great Emancipator had passed into the limbo of memory, and the boys who had marched away so bravely came plodding home, one by one.
In 1861, they had strode away to the lilting tune of John Brown's Body. In 1865, they returned home to the same tune, but this time the cadence was slow and with an aching sadness, and the words were poignant and reverent. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The vital statistics of the Civil War show that Colebrook sent 119 men to the conflict, including 3 officers, a quartermaster, and a musician.
Colebrook and her sister towns of Columbia and Stewartstown sent a total of 294 men, including 10 officers, 2 band leaders, a surgeon, and a quartermaster.
We are rather proud of the fact that although these 3 towns had only 1/6 of the Coos County population at the time, we sent 25% of the men who served from the county.
The figure of 119 men from Colebrook, however, is not completely accurate, for 1 man from this town fought for the South.
No one seems to know just why the 2 Marshall brothers felt impelled to take opposite sides in the Civil War, but they did. One fought to preserve the Union, while the other fought to preserve the Stars and Bars.
In later years, the rebel returned to Colebrook, and the 2 brothers lie side by side in the village cemetery. Both are veterans of the same bloody battles, but the flag of the Grand Army of the Republic flies over but one grave.
With the passage of the years, though their muskets grew heavier and their footsteps less jubilant, the Marshall brothers, like all others who served in that war, gathered bravely each Memorial Day for the long march up Cooper Hill to the Grand Army lot, where they did proper homage to those who would never climb the hill again.
January 7, 1927, Colebrook's last Civil War veteran, Mr. Alfred Newton Alls, made the last long march up Cooper Hill, borne by men of a younger generation.
It was the end of an era.
Episode 7, Social Calendar. When the Lincoln funeral cortege finally reached Springfield, Illinois, and disbanded, and after Andrew Johnson's attempted impeachment was thwarted, the country, at long last, found time to rejoice that peace had settled over the land. Colebrook, like the entire North, flushed with sweetness of victory, set out to enjoy itself. It seemed as though peace and plenty were here to stay. The West widened as the railroads pushed their way across the continent. This growth in population and habitation called on the Eastern sources for manufactured products, and New Hampshire expanded its factories to provide everything from cotton and woolen cloth to Concord coaches and locomotives. The burgeoning of downstate cities called for the North Country for the provision of lumber and wood products, potatoes, butter, and cheese. It was a time to make money and enjoy life, and our people did just that. True, they still worked hard. Money and leisure were never easily come by, but they did find time to play. As early as 1869, formal balls were being given regularly by the cream of local society. These dinner dances were held at the parson's house, the town's first hotel of stature. Affairs began at 6 p.m. and lasted until midnight. Music was rendered by an orchestra led by Albert F. Whipple, lately bandmaster of the 2nd New Hampshire Volunteers, and the dances were so intricate as to require the services of 2 floor managers. The price of attending one of these functions was $1, steep enough to keep out the riffraff, and it included supper. For those with less cash and fewer pretensions, there was the kitchen junket. These took place at almost any farm and village home whose kitchen was large enough, and our kitchens were always large. Preparations were simple. Furniture, including the stove, were removed out, and the fiddler was moved in. From that point, it was fun and games until daylight in the morning. Any occasion at all was reason enough to have a kitchen breakdown. It could be a barn raising, a corn husking, a hop picking, a quilting party, an apple paring, or just for the heck of it. The kitchen junket was a major form of entertainment for at least a century. Generations of country swains got to spark the girls and swing them around until the damsels' ankles were deliciously exposed. What more can one demand of entertainment? Of course, other exciting things happened during those years. As interest in fast horses developed and racing on a regular schedule commenced at our local half-mile track in 1875, the track later expanded into a full-size fairground, operated into the 1920s, and portions of it may still be seen at the site of our new hospital. Other contributing factors to the pleasures of the times included the establishment of our local newspaper, which celebrated its own centennial in 1970, the coming of traveling circuses, shows, medicine men, singing and spelling bees, home talent productions, and later, Chautauqua. Such things as these made up the social life of our town during the last century. Simple pleasures, perhaps, but we enjoyed our simplicity and thrived on it. Even then, we loved to see the sun go down behind Mount Monadnock and watch the sky turn to a scarlet promise of a fine day tomorrow. We still enjoy that sunset. Let us hope we always will.
Episode 8, The Iron Horse. The minute the first locomotive pulled the first load of varnish into the Baltimore Depot in the 1830s, it inspired the imaginations of empire builders, adventurers, speculators, honest men and rogues. Forward-thinking men in all areas of the United States realized that rapid transportation would mean the quick flowering of the remote places of the country. As early as 1844, Mr. Hezekiah Parsons, one of Colebrook's most progressive citizens, obtained a charter for proposed Colebrook Railroad. Before the incorporators could raise the funds for the actual construction, the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad in 1847 also applied for a charter. The proposed line to run from Portland, Maine to the Canadian border could only receive a charter by getting the Colebrook Railroad to give up its prior claim. The Atlantic Railroad, in a gentleman's agreement, verbally promised to build this track through Colebrook to the border, and the local incorporators, over Mr. Parsons' bitter protests, gave up its charter to the Atlantic Railroad. Mr. Parsons proved to be an excellent judge of character. With the charter in their pockets, the Atlantic and St. Lawrence crowd promptly welched on their pledge. They surveyed the lines from Shelburne, New Hampshire to Island Pond, Vermont, completely ignoring the Colebrook people who had made the railroad possible. Of course, Colebrook appealed to the legislature, but to no avail. During the 19th century, the big railroad interests owned the New Hampshire state legislature, lock, stock, and bank account. Thus was Colebrook and the North Country passed by. At the nearest railroad, where only a farm had been before, the village of North Stratford came into being. All commerce from Colebrook went to North Stratford by wagon, sled, and stage. One of the drivers, Preston Claffin, drove the 13 miles from Colebrook to North Stratford and back 6 days a week for 34 years in every kind of weather. The Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad, leased to the Grand Trunk as soon as it was completed, created in all 4 new villages in New Hampshire: Gorham, Berlin, Groveton, and North Stratford. The year 1869 was a year of triumph on both sides of the American continent. On May 10th of that year, a golden spike was driven at Promontory, Utah. East and West were forever bound together with ribbons of steel. Perhaps an even more formidable feat was accomplished that same year when the fabulous Cog Railroad, the first mountain railroad, was completed to the top of Mount Washington, New Hampshire. Not only could the Iron Horse run from sea to shining sea, it could also go from sea level to heaven itself. This was marvelous indeed, but did little for Colebrook and the North Country. But we wouldn't give up. In 1883, a group of Colebrook businessmen, with attorney Albert Barker as clerk, capitalized $44,000, receiving a charter to build a narrow gauge railroad from North Stratford to Pittsburgh to be called the Upper Coos Railroad. At this point, some of New Hampshire's biggest financiers, ever alert to a good thing, decided to get into the act. Frank Jones of Portsmouth not only owned several breweries, the Rockingham Hotel, the Wentworth by the Sea, and other goodies, but he was also one of the proprietors of the New Hampshire legislature. As soon as the charter was granted, Mr. Jones, with a fine nose for lucrative investment, gathered one of his cronies together to form a rival corporation, including Charles Sinclair and Colebrook's own mogul, a wheeler-dealer millionaire named George Van Dyke. This new corporation came forward and offered to build a standard gauge line from Stratford to the Canadian border at Beecher Falls, providing the Colebrook Group would surrender their charter and raise a gratuity of $25,000. Seeing the advantage of a standard gauge line, the Colebrook people quickly agreed. The money was raised, the charter changed hands, and the Upper Coos Railroad, now capitalized at $350,000, with George Van Dyke as president, became a reality. Can you imagine the mounting excitement as the work gangs piled their way northward, cutting a swath through hills and heaping up roadbeds across meadows until that great day when the first train painted with its cautious way into the fancy new station at the foot of Colby Street? The railroad had its formal opening on November 29, 1887, with a great public dinner, including a roast ox. Bands played, and there were speeches for guests at this elite bash. Once the railroad was a reality, the North Country truly flowered. Rapid transport to the market of milk, potatoes, and other farm products resulted in the development of specialized farming. The impact of lumbering was immense. The railroad replaced the rivers as the prime mover of our great stands of timber, since the Iron Horse was not dependent on the high waters of spring to deliver logs and pulp to the mills of Massachusetts. The last drives of long logs down the Connecticut River took place in 1912, and after that, the river knew only sporadic pulp drives into the 30s when they ceased entirely. The effect of our people was equally pronounced. Suddenly, the whole big wide world was but a ticket away. The world's goods, from pianos to threshing machines, were near as the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Excursions became the order of the day. It was quite the thing to go to Old Orchard Beach, Maine and back, all in one day for only $3. Many of our citizens who had never seen the ocean could now, for less than a week's wages, watch the tide come in, fill their shoes with sand, and fill their tummies with saltwater taffy. Also big in those days were the harvest excursions. The great winter wheat farms of Western Canada needed thousands of extra workers during harvest time. They would guarantee round-trip tickets to any man who was willing to work long hours and drink alkali water. Large numbers of our young men availed themselves of this opportunity. The railroad touched our lives of everyone, materially, environmentally, just for laughs. Wandering down the station to see the train come in was quite entertaining. One could see who was leaving, and from those who were getting off the train, one could pick up the latest gossip from outside world. The railroad station was our gateway to the universe and beyond our hills. But as the pattern of transportation slowly changed from trains to automobiles and trucks. Railroading declined. By 1930, passenger service had dwindled to one coach on a mixed freight train, and at the present time, we have only one freight train a day. This lonely freight creeps into the town late at night, self-consciously hiding its lowly state from the eyes of possible beholders. But when one hears the horn of the diesel engine in the wee small hours, our minds cannot convert it to the proud steam whistle of an earlier day. Our hearts can race in rhythm to the drive wheels of locomotives of those wonderful days when the iron horse was king.
Episode 9, the Mauve Decade. The Mauve Decade, historically, is that period between 1901 and 1910, when America was taking her place between the world powers. The rich were getting immensely richer, and everything was coming up roses. Actually, these years were but the end of a 40-year period, a time of enormous expansion. It started when the Iron Horse crossed the continent and Andrew Carnegie learned how to make heavy-duty rails. As the country grew, so did all forms of manufacturing. Americans were proud to show the world a century of progress at the Great Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. At this, the first American World's Fair, the New Hampshire exhibit must surely have been the worst. It consisted of Daniel Webster's plow, which required 4 oxen to draw, samples of native woods and wools, and for some bilious reason, 2 enormous stuffed hogs. However, the state managed to survive the indignity. Culture came to the hinterlands at the Columbian Exposition in 1893, and Stephen Duryer showed off his horseless carriage. The great fairs of the period were climaxed by the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis in 1904, which gave to the world such goodies as the ice cream cone and the hoochie coochie. America was flexing its muscles and showing itself off. It was the time of the Fifth Avenue palaces and Newport castles, of the 400 and title hunting debutantes, the time of Lily Langtry and Lillian Russell, of Diamond Jim Brady and Bet a Million Gates, of Harry K. Thaw and the girl in the red velvet swing. Even the White House went to extremes. During these years, it housed such divergent characters as Lemonade Lucy Hayes, who made an abomination of whiskey, and Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who made cigarette smoking by women a virtue. Under the leadership of Admiral Dewey, we bullied the last remnants of empire from the tired Spanish monarchy, and then to prove how fine we were, we strutted our stuff by sending the Great White Fleet around the world. Yes, those were great days, but what did they have to do with Colebrook? After the coming of the railroad, Colebrook started coming into her own, not only as a producer of lumber and dairy products, but almost as important as a recreational region. Summer vacationists who had long been stopping amid the White Mountains found their way to this, the last natural, unspoiled beauty spot in the state. This new source of revenue didn't catch the canny local folk napping. Every lake and pond within driving distance blossomed forth with sporting camps, and many an abandoned lumber camp was converted to the needs of the city deer slayer. For a nominal fee, the hunter was provided with a bed, board, and the services of a local citizen as guide. These local gents were woodswise, having been hunters all their lives. They were delighted to earn extra cash money, especially during the slack season between harvesting and logging. They knew how to spin a good hunting story, just how long to walk a city slicker in one day, And most important of all, they knew exactly where the deer were.
The other side of this recreational coin was the summer hotel. Several hotels were built or greatly enlarged for the purpose of caring for the influx of visitors. Among these were the Monadnock House, now Our Lady of Grace Academy, and the Hampshire Inn, now the Shrine of Our Lady of Grace. Another big hotel, its lobby and dining rooms, paneled in oak and cypress, was constructed on Lombard's Hill, but before the windows had been completely installed, a violent windstorm blew the dreams of its promoters into oblivion. By far, the biggest resort development in the area occurred in Dixville Notch. For many years, an insignificant inn had reposed at the western entrance to this magnificent mountain cleavage, just waiting for the right man. That man was one Mr. Henry S. Hale, whose great claim to fame, other than his Dixville Notch development, may be laid to his invention of a seat for Pullman cars. The marketing of this seat during the great days of railroading quickly made him a millionaire. But Mr. Hale was a man of vision, and having brought a new discomfort to a large segment of the traveling public, sought new worlds to conquer. His new world emerged as the Balsams Hotel and Country Club. Mr. Hale built a dream castle in an alpine setting, set it about with 3 man-made lakes, filled it with the beautiful people of the Mauve decade, and sat back to view the wonder he had wrought. Of course, there were slight annoyances. The opening had to be held up until a delayed shipment of monogrammed chamber pots arrived. Eventually, the highly necessary crockery was delivered and distributed. John Philip Sousa and his band arrived to provide music, and the grand opening of the Balsams was underway. It is interesting to note that one of the important guests at the opening was Mr. Stephen Duryea, who had exhibited a horseless carriage at the Columbian Exposition. The tradition established by Mr. Hale has persisted, though with less fanfare, and the Balsams has opened every year to those who wish to come and bask in the beauty of our beloved North Country. Time has, in some instances, altered the picture as Mr. Hale painted it. In 1929, spring thawing burst the dams holding the water of 2 of the Balsams lakes, and the resulting flood devastated the Mohawk Valley all the way to the Connecticut River. In Colebrook alone, 58 houses were damaged and 15 were completely demolished. Every home touched by those floodwaters are apt to have foundations a bit off center and slightly warped floors. 2 more reasons why the Hale name will never be forgotten by local folks. But all in all, the Balsams has contributed much to the welfare of Colebrook. It brought wealthy and influential people into the area, and for nearly 70 years now, local folks have been earning money during the tourist season at the Balsams. This influx of tourist money had vast effects on Colebrook, aside from the fact that going down to the station to watch the summer people come in was more interesting than going to a medicine show. Our ladies closely eyed the stylish dress of the idle rich in slavishly copied hats, frocks, and hairdos. These same idle rich, when shopping in local stores, demanded the finest quality that money could buy. It has thus become a tradition with us to do the correct thing well. This accent on quality, which is our inheritance from the Mauve decade, has added its own luster to our reputation as pace setters for the North Country. Other things also we have inherited from the Mauve decade. One of these was the temporary residence among us of the infamous Harry K. Thaw. After his trial and conviction for the murder of Stanford White, this overrated spoiled brat escaped from his bribed keepers and headed for Canada. Captured at the border, he was brought to Colebrook and domiciled in splendor while his family delayed extradition by buying officials right and left. In the end, they were successful. Thaw cheated justice entirely and passed away in Florida in 1948. However, while he was here, Colebrook was the center of national attention, a fact we've never forgotten and will always cherish as a high point of the whole era. Another lasting effect of the Mauve decade has been its music, beginning in the gay 90s with Bird in a Gilded Cage and ending with such tunes as Alexander's Ragtime Band. The whole era was replete with some of the most singable and enduring songs that were ever written. One heard them everywhere. Mr. Edison started the canning and home distributing process of music with his talking machine. The advent of the player piano added to the quick popularization of the music of the day. It was sung in every theater and vaudeville house and emanated from every home. Best of all, the songs were sung in the barbershops of every town. Each tonsorial parlor had its quartet. Every quartet prided itself on the richness of its expression and the beauty of its harmonies. This style of singing, barbershoppers, may be our finest legacy from the Mauve Decade. During this era, the utilities of modern life came to Colebrook: water and sewage, the telephone and the electric light. Toward the end of the decade, the automobile began to appear on our streets, and Colebrook entered the modern years that are contemporary with those of us who are middle-aged. 40 years that ended as the Mauve Decade must be remembered. They served to bridge the history of our first century to the memories of those still living today. They spanned the time and space between the planting of our centennial elms and the coming of the Model T Ford. The centennial elms are almost completely gone, and the Model T Ford is a nostalgic memory. But those robust years may well have been Colebrook's and the nation's finest hours.
Episode 10, A Call to Arms. When Woodrow Wilson entered the White House, the residents of Colebrook were enjoying the best of all possible worlds.
Never had we been so comfortable, so prosperous, or so happy. The more moneyed citizens sent their daughters to private and genteel schools to learn flower painting and tea pouring. These same people spent summer vacations at the seashore or the weirs, and the more adventurous even wintered in Florida.
The prominent men, in increasing numbers, were being seen on the streets and highways driving shiny new automobiles, and even the perennial poor were finding the necessary dollars to buy a Model T Ford.
The motion picture had come to town. There were annual fairs and circuses, stage and tent shows, amateur theatricals, and dances galore. Chautauqua made yearly appearances in our midst, and hundreds of listeners flocked to hear Dr. Russell H. Cornwell at the age of 70 deliver his world-famous lecture, Acres of Diamonds. It must have been a high point for local culture seekers.
As a Republican town, we had laughed good-naturedly at the outsized bathtub required by President Taft, and we viewed President Wilson with tolerance for, even though he was a Democrat, he at least had the good sense to spend his summers in Cornish, New Hampshire. And any man who loved New Hampshire can't be all bad. Of course, we wrote the whole Wilson family off as impossible.
But that was neither here nor there. They were good years, and the future of the world seemed to be peacefully assured. Mankind was too intelligent, and the heads of state too wise to ever again go to war.
Well, it was a nice thought.
Here in Colebrook, when first we realized that there was a war on in Europe, we weren't too concerned about it. True, some of our young men went down country to work in shipyards and other plants, engaged in turning out the tools of war. The Berlin Mills Paper Company in Berlin, New Hampshire became overnight the Brown Company, and the word German became synonymous with Bach and Hun.
In 1916, Wilson was reelected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." A popular song of the day proclaimed, "We've got another Washington, and Wilson is his name." And the good ladies of the town, while rolling bandages for the bleeding Belgians, hummed a comfortable tune entitled, "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier."
And yet our entry into the war was inevitable. The Allied propaganda was too intense, and the news photographs of Lawrence Stallings too appalling to be denied. Also, the sweeping German victories seemed to be frightening our dreams of peaceful isolation. It didn't seem important that the Allied defeats were their own fault.
The French army was so antiquated and so ill-equipped that the taxicabs of Paris had to be pressed into service to haul the new raw recruits to where the action was. The armies of England and France lacked not for personal bravery. The courage of the man was magnificent, but the leadership of these same armies was, without doubt, the worst in military history, with the possible exception of Field Marshal Montgomery's appalling stupidities in World War II.
Fighting under such handicaps, the Allies were unable to contain the well-oiled German war machine. America, always a champion of the underdog, was gradually being drawn into the conflict. The American Lafayette Escadrille was already adding youthful daring and glamour to the affair, and men were joining the Canadian Army to get in on the fun. The deciding event was the sinking of the Lusitania, an English ship loaded with Americans who should have known better. At once, the whole country was out for blood, and President Wilson, by popular demand, made the declaration of war.
At once, all America, including Colebrook, went on the warpath for the preservation of democracy and the liberation of the Polish Republic. Uncle Sam, assisted by James Montgomery Flagg, pointed from every billboard and newspaper proclaiming, "I want you." And the popular songs became "Over There" and "Down with Kaiser Bill."
The young men of Colebrook were not lacking in patriotism, and enlistments were heavy. The Colebrook Sentinel regularly published the names of the brave ones and kicked the cowards where it hurt with the tagline, "Is your name on this list?" In a small town like this, few men could withstand the open scorn of their peers and hasten to join up. Half the houses in town had service flags in the window, and new phrases like 26th Division and Camp Devens rolled from every tongue.
The factories of America, already geared to turning out every type of war implement, even tanks and the newly invented French 75, intensified production to equip this, the only modern army capable of meeting Germany on her own terms.
In Colebrook, another generation of girls were kissing their fellows goodbye and promising to write every day. To help the war effort, people willingly ate cornbread and went without sugar. They bought Liberty bonds and contributed to the Red Cross. They knitted socks for soldiers and collected walnut shells for gas masks.
There was bravado in the air, but there was also sadness. The casualty lists were closely watched, and when our first casualty was announced, the town was plunged into gloom and anger. The hometown boy was George O'Neill, and his memory was honored and perpetuated by his comrades when they named our American Legion post in his honor.
The music of the day, as always, reflected the mood of the people and was both brave and sad. Katie, Tipperary, and "Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning" was on every lip, as well as "Roses of Picardy," "Charmaine," and a lugubrious tribute to the Red Cross nurse.
In time, the war ended, as all wars must, and Colebrook did its share of celebrating. Church bells were rung, bonfires ignited, and there was a gala parade led by a Model T Ford laden with flag-waving girls. At last, the long struggle was over, and the world was permanently safe for democracy to grow and flourish.
Yes, the war was over, and the changes its passing had wrought in Colebrook at last began to be apparent. Not physical changes. Certainly the town looked almost precisely the same to the returning soldiers as it had when they'd left, except that from now on Memorial Day, a whole contingent of young veterans would march sprightly beside the tottering remnants of the Grand Army of the Republic.
But the great change in Colebrook took place in the minds of men themselves. The song, "How You Gonna Keep 'Em Down on the Farm," was proving most prophetic. How could we?
For the first time in generations, in most cases, local men had been to sea. They had crossed the wide Atlantic, crawled on their stomachs halfway across Europe, and faced death from an enemy that they could not see.
These boys who had gone from us had returned as men, strange men with widened horizons and broader viewpoints. Although many of the veterans settled among us, the majority had developed the itching heel of their forefathers and had to see what was beyond the next hill, settle in the busy places of the world, and concern themselves with the new technology that the war had produced.
Two other events growing out of World War I must be mentioned here. While the attention of all thinking people was diverted by the war, a rare group of Twitter-pated idealists calling themselves the Prohibition Party reached the ear of a lackluster legislator named Andrew Volstead and rammed a law through Congress declaring the selling and imbibing of spirits to be illegal.
And while the Senate was still punch drunk from that one, the suffragettes, a motley crew, descended from Fanny Bloomer and Carrie Chapman Catt, secured the enfranchisement of women.
But Colebrook has survived many disasters, including these, and remains what I believe to be the best town in the best state in this old country of ours.
Episode 11, Running Through the Rye. When we think of the Roaring Twenties, we may recall the Charleston, the Flappers, the Black Bottom, the Open Roadster, Rudolph Valentino, the Breakaway, and the silent Kyle Coolidge. I said we may recall these things. The one thing I know we will recall is booze. It was booze that made the Roaring Twenties roar. Therefore, the Roaring Twenties actually started in October 1919, perhaps the blackest date in our national history, and ended in 1933.
The Prohibition Party and the Women's Christian Temperance Union for years had been attempting to interfere with mankind's few pleasures. Granted, our liquor laws at the time needed revision. Local liquor agents were not above accepting an occasional bottle of free booze for merely ignoring an infraction of the law, and opening and closing hours of corner saloons were generally unsupervised. Beer could be bought by the bucket and whiskey by the keg. Age limits were unheard of, and many other things needed remedying. Almost to a man, our local gentry enjoyed an occasional swig of spirits, and so did their spouses, although theirs were taken with a spoon solely for medicinal purposes. I know of one worthy matron who wore out a tablespoon every 6 months just for reasons of health. Yes, something needed to be done, but complete prohibition was never the answer. Nevertheless, prohibition was the order of the day, and as did the rest of the nation, Colebrook accepted the law, not as a total defeat of reason, but as a challenge, an obstacle to be surmounted. It is a known fact that when Colebrook accepts a challenge, the town always comes out the victor. At once, all the liquor in town went underground. The saloons went out of business, and the hotel barrooms were as dry as a WCTU convention. However, in 1921, when President Warren G. Harding paid Colebrook a visit and gave a brief address on the wonders of North Country beauty and hospitality, sufficient protocols were unearthed to ease the discomforts of presidential traveling and spellbinding. As soon as news of impending passage of the Volstead Act reached Colebrook, all those who could do so put in a secret supply of liquor against the arid days ahead. It was fortunate that we lived near the border. Overnight, the international boundary had assumed vast importance to the people on both its sides. With generations, it had been little more than a line on the map, bordered by Daniel Webster and Lord Ashburn. But with the onset of the Roaring Twenties, all this was changed. Smuggling of booze on the local level began at once. For a time, liquor was brought over the border quite openly, as the existing customs officials, being local men and no doubt related to half the people in town, were not inclined to put the arm on a friend with a genuine thirst. Later, as men were added to the border forces for inspection and control, the smuggling grew greater but more subtle. From the very first, traffic in booze proved most profitable. It was as easy to smuggle a lot as a little. A man could sell his surplus to his pals, neighbors at a markup that made the operation worthwhile. Many citizens living along the border had relatives residing on the neighboring farms just across the line. So smuggling was accomplished with great ease. The federal government did not pay for fencing the border, so it was no wonder that existing fencing disappeared and herds of cattle and horses, cases of scotch and rye strapped to their backs, wandered almost nightly Canadian farms to American farms. Once on the side of the line, distribution was easily accomplished. Colebrook's first liquor market was the Colebrook Fairgrounds. The annual fairs had recently disappeared from the scene, along with the steam-powered carousel and Fred's Pigs, but you'd never have known it in the early days of Prohibition. Eyewitnesses have told us that it was not unusual to see 100 or more cars gathered at one time. The owners, busy as bees, prudently laying up supplies for winter, with cases of booze being transferred from car to car and money going from pocket to pocket. News of the easy availability of booze took only a short time to reach the thirsty cities to the south. Parched Bostonians informed their favorite bootleggers that they could use some genuine Canadian club. To the great American public of the 1920s, a good bootlegger was more important than a good broker. Hence, the bootleggers, organized in the games and syndicates, they lost no time in setting up here and making mutually profitable arrangements with some of our more daring local citizens. It was apparent that there was big money to be had in owning a lot of horses and a piece of unfenced land along the border. The road through Colebrook became a river through which daily flowed sufficient spirits to brandy every peach from here to Long Island Sound. Once the smuggling of booze became a big-time thing, the flea market concept disappeared in favor of the speakeasy and the blind pig. On an average, every 10th house down the highway sold liquor, and one neighboring town became known far and wide as Little Canada. So many of its households were engaged in this good work. One enterprising wife and mother kept a wash tub of sudsy water in her kitchen the year round. On top of the water floated a pair of overalls, and beneath the overalls, there usually reposed from 40 to 60 pints of whiskey. This lady, over the years, endured the indignity of several raids, but never once did an officer fish beneath the overalls for hidden hooch. It was so easy to break the law that the whole nation went on a gleeful sleigh ride of living dangerously. It was the age of Roadhouse and the dance pavilion. The principal place of entertainment in our area was the noted Bluebird Pavilion, 2 miles out of Colebrook, a huge place where crystal ball glittered down on crowds of 2,000 or more, dancing to every famous band of the time, all the way from Paul Whiteman to Melly Dunham. And that's the way it was in the roaring 20s, a time more frantic than gay, more gin-soaked than happy, a time that frightened our nation with the gangs which has now grown into huge crime syndicate, a time that gave us people such as John Dillinger and Al Capone. Those same years have given us some of our finest music, our greatest literature, and some of our fondest memories. To be truthful, I wouldn't want to go through it again.
Episode 12, The Big War. The actual ending of Prohibition was something of an anticlimax. Life as we had lived it in the roaring 20s came to an end on a Friday morning in October of 1929. Who could ever forget the days of the Great Depression? Overnight, our sense of values changed. The new roadster we had planned on, the one with the rumple seat and the four-wheel brakes, was not nearly as important as a pair of shoes without holes in the soles. And taking that place in Florida for the season became a forgotten dream when we were trying to find next month's rent. Almost at once, the lighthearted strains of Ain't We Got Fun was gone, and even the echo was drowned out by the plea, brother, can you spare a dime? The world was filled with bad news. England went off the gold standard. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks got divorced, and some rabble-rouser over in Germany, a fellow named Adolf Hitler, burned down the Reichstag and put the blame on doddering old Premier von Hindenburg. But we had no time for the follies of other people in other places. We had our hands full just getting enough to eat. We needed something, anything, to bring us back to the normality we had known, and the election of 1932 gave us, if not improvement, at least something new to think about.
Herbert Hoover was swept out of the White House, and the forces of Franklin Roosevelt went marching in to the tune of Happy Days Are Here Again, a song that the Democratic National Convention still throws into the program whenever the delegates can't make up their minds. One of the three outstanding actions of the Democratic administration of the 1930s was the repeal of the 18th Amendment. This action slaked the thirst of a nation and took our minds off other troubles. It also left so many bootleggers unemployed that they were forced to indulge in a wave of kidnapping before they finally smartened up and muscled into the labor unions and other legal rackets. The second outstanding action of the Democratic Party was the bank holiday. This temporary bank closure was, I believe, a needed gesture, although countless individuals, already bleeding from the Depression, saw the last of their savings swept away in the worthless assets of the many banks who could not reopen their doors and went into bankruptcy. Here in Colebrook, we were bloody but unbowed. Since our farms produced food and our forests grew the raw material for newsprint, we managed to work and keep busy, even though the paycheck was small and we might be forced to sell our best cow to pay the taxes.
We were daily reminded of the benefits of life in the country. When we picked up a daily paper for which our woodlot may have provided the stock and saw pictures of men standing in bread lines, we took comfort that though the American farmer might wear overalls, he still ate at the first table. Our stockbrokers' city cousins, who had for years ignored us except for an annual brief call each autumn to show us their new cars and get a free barrel of apples, now saw fit to return and move in with us just till things get better. We welcomed them into our homes as magnanimously as Joseph had welcomed his brethren. Again, I repeat, Colebrook was one of the most fortunate of towns, for while a large number of New England banks never survived the bank holiday, both of our local institutions come through the hiatus with no loss of prestige or deposits.
Undoubtedly, the reason for this goes back to the beginning of the town, when our ancestors learned from the example given them by the failure of Pratt and Smith, as we told you in episode 4. No, the lives of we Colebrook people were not ruined by the falling market. We managed to go on working, eating, paying our taxes, and going to the movies on Saturday night. We laughed with Amos and Andy, wept with Mert and Marge. For brain work, we tried to cope with the NRA, the WPA, the CCC, and such other alphabetical dandruff has drifted down to us from the balding head of state. Yes, we survived the Great Depression the way we have always survived the nation's disasters, with courage and all the help we could give to our less fortunate fellow men. The last big thing that changed Colebrook was the onset of World War II. The conflict starting in 1939 was at first very far away from us. Almost the only thing we were conscious of was that the German upstart, Adolf Hitler, had hoisted Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain on his own umbrella, while he himself sought to pluck the fairest countries of Europe to garland the Third Reich. Overnight, defense plants bloomed, aircraft factories mushroomed from fallow ground, and shipyards were awarded lush contracts on a cost-plus basis. Now, for the first time, Colebrook felt the breeze from the far-off whirlwind of war. People began to leave the area in droves, not just those who had been driven to us by the storm of depression, but whole families of our native stock, lured by the fantastic wages offered by Ford, Kaiser, and Pratt & Whitney.
The first peacetime draft began to pluck the young men from our farms and streets, supposedly for preparedness, but any sagacious person could see the inevitability of war. Bosch, Hun had given way to Nazi and Gestapo, but the meaning was there. Hate was building up, and the wise man was filling his closets with sugar and his basement with new tires. Who can forget December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor? In the wink of an eye, the defense plants became war plants. Defense bonds became war bonds. Songs like Remember Pearl Harbor and You're a Sap, Mr. Jap satisfied our patriotic fervor, while a sloppy sentiment of Lily Marlene and the White Cliffs of Dover rendered us suitably melancholy. We were going overseas in increasing numbers. Next to our boys and girls in service, the biggest things in our lives were the newscasts on the radio. The sonorities of Lowell Thomas could plunge us into despair, while the mellifluous tones of Gabriel Heater and his "Ah, there's good news tonight" filled us with hope that all was not necessarily lost. Never had our town been so concerned with one thing as we were with World War II. In the Civil War, it had still been possible for a man to buy his way out of service by hiring a substitute to take his place. And World War I had lasted a mere 18 months. World War II, however, was with us for nearly 4 long years, and all America was imbued with only one thought: winning the war. Almost daily, more of our young folks were accepted into the armed services, while others were swept into the rush of war production. America was one huge machine turning out the tools of war. Sometime during those years, we passed the point of no return, and we are now nibbling away at the last half of our natural resources. But that meant nothing to us then. We were out to win a war, and by golly, we won it. The winning was announced to the world by smoke signal, a mushroom-shaped cloud over Hiroshima. Winning the war had cost us a great deal, including the lives of 5 of our local patriots, including Malcolm Harvey, who had served with distinction in both world wars. It also cost us peace of mind. But be that as it may, We answered the call to arms, and we won the big war.
Epilogue. Colebrook's first historian, Jason Dudley, writing nearly a century ago, penned these lines. Man in his youth looks forward. His life is all before him, and with joyous anticipations of pleasure and happiness the future will bring to him, he presses forward, seldom looking back, till the summit has been gained. But when he passes the meridian and begins to go down the decline of life, he is prone to look backward. Mr. Dudley, as you gather, was one of the more erudite men of his time and place, and what he said was quite, but not altogether true or pertinent to Colebrook today. This is our bicentennial, but we are not about to admit that we are heading down the decline of life. True, we've spent the last 2 hours in looking backward and reminiscing, but we are hopefully looking forward to a few more centuries of growth and usefulness before we throw in the sponge and begin our descent from the summit. Since it is true that the seeds of the future were sown in the past, our strengths and our weaknesses will be the strengths and weaknesses passed on to us by our forefathers and mothers. As they had courage to tread the untrodden path, to face the faceless danger, and to solve the many problems that could not be solved, may we have the courage to do likewise. If it takes pride to do this, they have given us a proud tradition. If it takes labor, they have provided us with the New England conscience that makes a virtue of labor. If we can remain true to ourselves as they were, then we cannot be false to the generations that come after us. May we live our lives in such manner that our descendants can be proud of us as we are proud of the ancestors who loved this land and passed it on to us as a trust for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I give you Colebrook. It was a very special time.
In the summer of 1970, I was actually traveling cross-country camping with a friend.
It was really a fun time.
I had this image in my mind of like the parade.
It was just a great time, a lot of great memories.
My neighbors at one time are my students, almost everybody here, so I'm tickled with the whole thing.
That was my introduction to Colebrook, was the bicentennial.
We really enjoyed working with Colebrook people and putting it all together.
Ursula George was very involved in the Bicentennial Committee, and her husband Andrew actually owned the insurance agency in town that my dad worked for. So my father was actually very participatory in the Bicentennial, and I always asked him about the pageant. You know, when I started getting that interest in history when I was a little kid, I said, what did you do in the Bicentennial pageant? Because I thought a pageant, you must have acted and spoke lines, and I didn't quite get that. He said, no, I stood in like a shopkeeper's outfit with a cigar in my mouth, and I kind of sit there and chewed it while they were going through the scenes. But he always had great memories of it. The sad part, my mom doesn't, because my brother and sister were very small at the time. A babysitter was expensive, so she had to stay home. So my father participated in all the events of the Bicentennial, including the parade. They had a big float in the parade that he drove. My sister was on top as Little Miss Muffet, and he was active in the whole thing, but it was always behind the scenes. That's where he was. He was another one of those worker bees doing things behind the scenes. But he had a great memory of doing the pageant. He thought it was a lot of fun and really enjoyed it. So for me, I will tell you, for the history of Colebrook, one thing when I kind of restarted, the Historical Society was tried to start up in the late 70s, didn't kind of succeed. And in 1991, 92, when I started the Historical Society, that was the first thing everybody talked about was the Bicentennial. We did a lot of programs reminiscing about that. And what was great for me was, I'm only about 20 years old at the time, but it was so many of those people that were actively involved, Rusty Wiswell, Ellsworth Bunnell. I really got firsthand accounts of what they went through to do it. The neat thing was with the Bicentennial, and they talked about it many times, the Bicentennial really came out of the cookbook. The cookbook was a little
Right.
project that they started. They thought, oh, wouldn't it be great to do a cookbook for the bicentennial? Gifford was working on a town history and he figured he'd have it ready by then. He was scrambling to put it together. And so actually what it was, Pearlie Davis and a group from alumni put together the cookbook. And through that spurned a group said, we need to celebrate the bicentennial. So that's when Ellsworth and Rusty got together to really work on the bicentennial for that. And I will tell you this, Ellsworth, I mean, I feel like I'm Ellsworth this year with everything I've had to put in the effort over the last years. Ellsworth literally was a local businessman with the Blossom Shop. And for a year prior to that, when he started working on this, he literally spent day in, day out working on the bicentennial. He wrote this pageant, just again, another add-on to do to that. But he really did the yeoman's effort of the behind the scenes organizing, getting the press out. We have a lot of records in the Historical Society from the bicentennial that Ellsworth gave us. And I mean, he was the co-chair, but let me tell you, it was his spirit that really led this whole thing, and how appropriate. Here we are redoing this pageant that was his. And you know what's awesome to me is I wasn't around during the bicentennial, and here I've got a chance with all you, and I will again, a chance to actually be part of it again, which I think it's just great. Just
Let
great.
me just add to that, David, that Renee, your hard work and this ingenious idea of yours prompted me to take Dr. Gifford's book off the shelf 4 days ago and read the whole thing again. And David, I'd recommend that you do that, and everyone here. It's just marvelous.
And I know I was away at college, so I didn't get to get the whole flavor of the bicentennial, but it actually was going on all summer long with the Brothers of the Brush and other things like that. In fact, I recently found my Brothers of the Brush certificate, though my beard was nothing like this for that time around. As I said when I introduced myself, I was the person who designed and constructed the stage upon which the bicentennial pageant was presented. I did it as a theater major project at the University of New Hampshire, and I was the one that suggested, and they went on and actually had a good result of having 12 scenes, but taking through 3 end scenes on each end and kind of wrapping it around so it was more of a U shape instead of a straight across stage. My big mistake, though, was I thought if we had a raked stage where it was an old tradition in vaudeville that they would have an angled stage that angled down towards the front. That was where upstage and downstage came from. And by having that you'd have better visibility of what was going on the stage floor. And I really shouldn't have done that because they had I think it was an accordion band that did a concert before the afternoon matinee of the pageant. And the poor guys in the accordion band had brought all their castered speakers for their sound system. And all of the darn things kept rolling down the stage. And luckily we had a few blocks of 2x4 left over that they were able to block the things so they stayed put and the performance could continue. But that was kind of an interesting thing. We ended up, it was all made out of 2x4s. And what I did was I ordered 2x4s from both the lumber yards in town, and I took over the old creamery building right there at the end of the airport, and I borrowed a saw, and I cut 2x4s and had a jig made up, so I had all the frameworks for the stage built. And then when it was time to set it up, my father and a couple other neighbors came over and helped me, and we just started into the main stage, setting it up and putting 2x4s in between. I think it was every 4 feet was what they usually were, except for the spot where they did the square dance. And then they were every 2 feet in order to support all the people. And then there were sheets of plywood that went over the top. And once we had the stage built and braced, we put up the sections of the background, which someone else had built. And those were 2x4 frames with homozote. And they were set up, they were painted. I think we taped the cracks with masking tape in order to be able to have a smooth surface for the scene painter to go to work. And the whole scene was painted right there on the stage. She had to put up with the angle of the stage for the ladders and for the paint cans.
I do remember my Aunt Patty, she painted the background, like kind of like, as Ellsworth says in the introduction, like Currier and Ives, black and white paintings.
I don't remember who it was that said, we're doing it black and white, but that was the best decision to be made because of the time factor, because she had to do a lot of work in a very short time. Something that I especially remember, though, was in a little bit in the afternoon, but really in the evening. It was not just a bicentennial pageant, but it was a drive-in bicentennial pageant. And there was a whole row of cars right along the edge of the road by Keach's Field where it happened. And everybody sat there, and whenever there was an appropriate point to clap, instead of clapping, they were blowing their horns. And it was it was fun. Just made it a unique thing.
It was so exciting as a little kid when Harry Olmsted drove some old car right across the front of the stage, or the lip of the stage, you know, all being crazy flappers and gin swiggers. But I remember as a kid, it was just like, wow, breaking the fourth wall.
Yes. Though you didn't know it was the fourth wall at that time.
Talking about what Ellsworth was doing is like, you know, the word for that now is producing artistic director and auteur. I mean, it really was extraordinary.
I remember going into the Blossom Shop and talking with Ellsworth as he was putting this all together and listening to his stories about it. There were two big fun things. Well, actually more. They had a Keystone Cops thing, and of course the Brothers of the Brush, and they had running, funny games and commentaries between the groups, and they would try to catch people and put them in the stocks that they had. And they had, of course, a huge parade for the bicentennial. I think it was the biggest parade I was ever in. And I remember it because we've got pictures of me on a float. And Katie gave me this morning, shipped a picture out of, they did it by classes. And so a night of graduation, and 1932, or actually 1931, the 30s picture, my dad was in. And my class was 1970. So of course we were at the tail end of that parade. And I was in the picture also. I was in the parade. And one of the most fun nights was that, and highlights of the whole, I graduated in that year. So as a senior, it was a very, very exciting year. And for my senior year, I got to have the bicentennial. I graduated, I went to the reunion, and our whole class was the junior class that made the reunion. And so we're the junior class in the Colebrook history book too, the school days. And it's just thinking back on all that, the parades, the picnics, the pageant. I remember the pageant was so well attended towards the end, you couldn't get tickets to it. It was so good. And I remember being so impressed with the number of things that were going on up on the stage at the same time. And it was interesting, Robbie, to hear your telling of the structure and the building of that. It was a very, very exciting year. And I was in the pageant. It was a long, long time ago in a very small part, but it was neat to be a part of it.
I remember that the whole family raided the upstairs attic at my grandfather's and grandmother's house on Monadnock Street, and I ended up with his World War I uniform. And the amazing thing was it fit me. Even the shoes, the boots were a little small though. So by the end of the bicentennial ball, I had very sore feet.
I lived in Concord during the summer of preparing for the ceremony. I got married in August. So my mother-in-law, who was the editor of the News and Sentinel at the time, she managed to get our wedding announcement in the newspaper. Okay, so we're on our honeymoon. We come back the day before the bicentennial starts. So we go to the pageant. The next day at the parade, I believe I have the sequence correct. The next day at the parade, we run into Dr. Gifford, because he's a big mover of the hospital. So we're talking to him, and we bought one of his books, so he signed it. And he looks at Karen McNeely, that's who I married. He says, Karen, what do you do anyways? And she says, well, I'm a registered nurse. He says, I can hire you for the hospital right now on the spot if you choose. And so be it. She was one of the first employees of that hospital. Right there in the middle of the parade. So the other thing that happened during the bicentennial, we missed this, was they had the biggest reunion for Colebrook Academy at Aunt Libby's down in Columbia ever. And I missed it. And I made a pact with myself at that point that I would never, ever miss another reunion, or that my class would ever be less than anybody else's class in any reunion. And I pretty much lived up to that. How, Lucille? Class of 1963 at Colebrook.
Yes, you have, Terry. You have. You lead us well. We don't dare not show up.
Well, I'm particularly tickled to be here with another one of my classmates today, Lucille. So yeah. I think it's great.
I did want to say regarding teaching, I figured out that in 1924, my mother graduated from Colebrook Academy at the age of 16. She had gone to a one-room school, so she skipped a bunch of grades, right? So anyway, and on the spot after graduation, she was hired to be a teacher in a rural school, which she did for until I was 5. Well, she stopped teaching when she got married. She had to stop teaching. And then she went back to teaching and eventually got a job in town, which was her big dream. Later, by the time I went into 2nd grade, she became a 1st grade teacher, so I never had her in school.
How many people on this in this group have had Mrs. Sutton as a teacher?
Oh, must be everyone.
Not as a substitute.
No,
She was
not
substituting when I was little.
Yeah.
Great, that's great.
She skipped us.
Is anybody here in the old schoolhouse? I managed to have Mrs. Sutton in 1st grade at the old schoolhouse with the rope down the middle of the stairwell for the bell.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
yes.
Remember that? And the
Oh,
slide.
yeah.
And the slide. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, fire escape
were
slide
kids.
that we all wanted to go down.
We lived
Yeah, right, I'd forgotten.
We could
top of the hill, so Gary and I would walk to the bottom of the hill before they closed off the slide and climb up the slide and slide all the time.
All the time.
Bro, I was 8 at the time, 7 and 8 that year. So I've recalled a lot of things from listening to you all now, because I was fascinated with Ellsworth Bunnell always, and I seem to remember the ending to a story Gary was telling, where either dad or mom would occasionally liken him to Liberace, which I thought was perfect. Okay.
Yes.
At least I thought it was perfect as I got older and understood more about the world. As far as the pageant, as far as the actual celebration goes, I remember thinking it was the biggest thing I had ever seen in my life, you know? And I don't know that the town's done anything since that would compare in size and scope. Maybe 50 years from now, we'll be able to do something like that that's comparable.
Just want to make that one point about Ellsworth on the organ, because Amy and my brother Pete's Aunt Peggy McCarney, who was a soloist in the pageant, they played together all the time at the Colebrook house. And so those, I remember we, as kids, sometimes my Aunt Peggy was babysitting us. We were out out of the Colebrook house, outside on the porch there. Well, we could hear Ellsworth and Aunt Peggy rehearsing. And I'd forgotten, of course, Ellsworth not only did all the writing and the producing, you know, the mastermind, but he also provided the soundscape, essentially, came from his imagination and his love of music and knowing all the songs from all the eras. Of course, he's really tied to that barbershop era in the mob decade. He was very nostalgically recalling in his work.
When you were talking about the different groups, I was amazed by the Keystone Cops. I thought they were the coolest thing. And I remember I always wanted Dad to grow a beard, and he didn't, though. He never grew a beard, but he had permission to not grow a beard, because there was some way that you could buy like an indulgence from the old Roman Catholic Church. You could buy your way out of having to grow a beard and stay out of jail. And that certificate, at least the last time I was in Colebrook, was still in above his sock drawer in his bedroom closet.
The thing I remember about the summer that everybody was mentioning, the Brothers of the Brush, there were tea parties, like Victorian tea parties certain ladies held. There was a fashion show that did get my attention. I think it was in the town hall at one point. Our next door neighbors, the Corvos, were all dressed up like powdered wigs and silk knee breeches in the sort of, you know, Lafayette and Washington 1770s style. It was really incredible to see people that you usually saw coming back from their logging jobs or whatever they were doing for the farm, all dressed up in these different ways. And it was like a very magical, crazy time. And of course, when we were little, basically, I think this was probably true for just about everybody. You could leave the house as a young person, as a very young person, and as long as you were back by 6 o'clock for dinner, nobody cared. The next door neighbors would look after you in some way or another. So we were all over town seeing what was going on and seeing those Keystone Cops just chase people around sort of randomly. So much fun.
If I can break in, I've got a few things. First off, there is a genuine Brothers of the Brush certificate, which I came across. I've been going through old boxes. I even found some of my working drawings for the design for the bicentennial stage. But this is, whoops, there it is.
Ellsworth?
To the right.
Yep.
This was, whoops, can you see it okay?
Yeah.
Yep, this was the program for the tribute to Ellsworth called Down Memory Lane, which was the Kiwanis did it in 1978 as he was semi-retiring from showbiz in Colebrook, at least. Great. And the other thing, couple of things is we didn't mention, sorry about the train. We didn't mention Richard Levitt. He was another very important person in the bicentennial. And he did a lot of the layout work for the Colebrook Cookbook and also for two other books, Colebrook Yesterday and the Colebrook Academy Days. The local banks underwrote the Colebrook Academy book, and I can't remember who did the Colebrook Yesterday book.
That was Levitt. Levitt did the Colebrook Yesterday.
Those two
he did
books
all the work on that.
Cookbook. What's that?
Levitt, the cookbook was done by a committee, and Levitt did all of Colebrook Yesterday and Colebrook School Days. He did all of the work on that. He had help on School Days, but Colebrook Yesterday, which was a photo montage, Levitt related to me. I'll just real quick. I don't want to, because again, when I was younger and I started with the Historical Society, Levitt was still alive and well, and I asked him a lot of questions about that. And I said, "How did you do that?" You can hear me now, Rob? I said, how did you plan to do it? He said, we put ads out, let people know we were interested in old photos. He had a little office in the upstairs of the F&T bank. And what people would do is, Levitt said, I'd come in and there would be stacks of photos with a little note from Ruth Walker, from Harry Alls, from Gerald, older residents of town. And he said, the worst part about it was, he said, there was so many photos I couldn't use, but he said, it took me probably a year to get the photos back because I had to figure whose photos were whose. The neat thing is, over the years in the Historical Society, because we've been around for almost 30 years now, we have gotten given a lot of photos that I've actually been able to scan that were actually in that book. There's a lot we didn't, but that was really neat. So yeah, Levitt did the work, but Russ Ingram in the bank was really pusher. He wanted to get that book out in time because Colebrook yesterday was out just in time for the bicentennial, where Colebrook school days didn't come out till early the next year. Because of the time it took to do it. So
I see.
Let me just get something off my chest. The reason I don't have a lot of colorful stories and remembrances is because in 1970, I met my current wife, Patty, at a summer school in Concord, and I brought her by bus to the Colebrook Bicentennial. And every story that she tells about her experience, her first experience in Colebrook, having grown up in the metropolis of Manchester, is just to die for.
Gary and I had met at St. Paul's School and started dating, and he had visited me at my house. And this was the first time I was going to go up to Colebrook. And my mother, I had my driver's license, but my mother didn't want me to drive because it was such a long trip. And so I took the bus. And the bus was an eternal trip. And on the bus were all these older people who had moved away from Colebrook but were going back for the bicentennial, and we got to talking, and they said to me, so are you going up to visit somebody from Colebrook? And I said, yes, I'm going up to visit Gary Hicks. And they said, oh, is he Parker's son? And I said, well, yes, he is. And they looked at me and they said, aren't you a mite young for Parker's son? Because they were thinking that Gary's father was Parker, but Gary's father's father was Parker. They thought I was going up to visit Gary's father. They'd been away a while. I was 16 at the time. So when I got to the house, it was well after 11, and they decided it was time for me to go to bed, and that I would be sharing not only Pam's room, but Pam's bed. And I hadn't met her yet. So I said, no, I'll sleep on the couch. I'm very happy to sleep. No, it's a double bed and you'll be fine. And so I reluctantly agree, and I get into the bed on the far side near the window because Pam, I'm told, sleeps on the other side, and the window's open, and I fall asleep, and sometime in the night, this furry thing jumps on my face, and I'm in the middle of the wilderness, I believe, and God knows what it could be. I thought it was probably a raccoon, and I wake up breathing, and I grab the cat, what turns out to be a cat, but I grab this animal and fling it across the room, and it hits the bookcase and goes, meow. And then Pam gets up on her elbow, looks at me, and she said, that was my cat.
Welcome to
that's how I met Pam. And so one more story, and that is that I took part in all of the old home days of the bicentennial, and I found it fascinating. And I was informed early on that I needed to buy an old-timey dress, which I did. I thought it was beautiful. It had a bustle, and it was pale blue, and I loved it. And every day we'd get dressed in, I'd get dressed in this dress, and we'd get dressed up. We'd parade up and down Main Street. And on the 5th day that I was there, Gary's mother pulled me aside and said, dear, would you like to borrow a slip? Because, you know, you can see right through that dress. That was the 5th day.
My memory is, I think because I was the youngest of the Bucciarelli children, Renee and Peter probably were old enough to go to friends' houses, and I wasn't. I was probably about in kindergarten, like Claudel, David's sister. So I remember being dragged to a lot of the rehearsals and just like sitting under the piano or sitting under a ladder, which seems like right now a very dangerous place to put a 5-year-old. But Patty was probably, our Aunt Patty was probably told to kind of watch me while she did something else. And that's where I ended up. So that was just kind of neat, just not really understanding a lot of the conversations, but being part of it. It was very alive. But David, you mentioned Claudel being Little Miss Muffet on the float. And until you said that, I had this image in my mind of like the parade, and I was trying to think of what was this. And I remember being in awe of her. Like that was so cool that she got to do that.
I remember being a kid. Actually, it's kind of interesting. I think I was oblivious to the pageant in many ways because it was something we were made to do with my mom. It wasn't until much later in my life I realized how deeply this pageant and the whole community effort, because I run a nonprofit and have done a couple that are geared to bringing stories to the community. And it's after our mom died when I actually picked up this book, Even to This Valley, that I opened it and saw that my mother was the director. I was stunned because my mother was just my mother, just dragging it here and there. I had no idea.
I have memories of the fashion show to share too. Not just of the show, but of the lead up to the show, because my younger brother, Mike, and I had matching Kelly Green, historically inaccurate costumes designed that we wore. And they were sort of something like what a pilgrim would wear. And but I remember most of all having them being fitted for them, because Oriette Dupuis made them from whole cloth. And we would go over, I want to say we went over once a week for a period of weeks, and she produced these amazing outfits for us. The memory of that show is amazing. And then I saw today a picture of our mother walking the boardwalk or whatever they had, whatever you call the walk at the fashion show, the runway, I mean. And she's stunning, you know, in that period outfit. And I remember how impressive all the ladies were, okay? And I've got that memory stuck in my head from 50 years ago at age 8 as well.
It was a real town effort. That's the thing that stands out for me, even as a kid at that time, remembering how everybody was included in some way, or could be if they wanted to be. But all these women sewed. Ginny Berry, who lived next door to us, was one of those people.
Completely irrelevant, Renee, but that you just jogged my mind of what you wouldn't let me say earlier. But your next door neighbor, Mike Berry, went to and graduated from Beloit. And later on, subsequently became the CEO, I think CEO of the Barnes and Noble.
On the Beloit business, I taught school for many, many, many years in the elementary school, and right across the hall from me was Tracy Redding, the social studies teacher. She graduated from Beloit University and never knew the connection between that and the Congregational Church until I told her. I says, that's amazing, because there's so many things in Beloit that point to Colebrook.
I specifically asked to read the Exodus to Beloit because when I met my wife in Oregon, I learned that she was from Wisconsin, and she was originally born in Beloit, lived there for the first 12 years of her life. So it's interesting that we have these odd bits of serendipity in our lives.
In regard to the costuming and the pageant, there were certain costumes that were hard to find. There was a gentleman who ended up retiring, lived up, he called this place the Eagle's Nest, Spiro Legoulis. And Spiro Legoulis had a costuming company in Boston at the time. My father told me this. And what they did, a lot of the particular costumes they needed, like you look at some of the old soldier costumes, where, you know, they couldn't have been made. He actually let them use them. Whatever they needed for specific costuming. I wish I could, Boston costume, I wish I could think of the name of the company. I'll have to jog my memory, but he actually provided those for the pageant. Like you said, Renee, a lot of the ladies made costumes for their children, but there were some specific ones that were needed, and he gladly provided them for that. The other thing was neat is Beloit, Wisconsin. Last year, I was lucky enough to travel to Milwaukee, and I took a week's vacation. And I said, I'm going to Milwaukee. I got to go to Beloit. Well, Beloit is an interesting community. Beloit, I would call, if anybody realized kind of Berlin, New Hampshire, a former mill town, Beloit became a huge metropolis because of foundries. What's happened is they went through a big bust about 60, 70 years ago, and the town is under a revitalization, and they're coming back. So I went to the First Congregational Church, where the Congo Church was. They mentioned about the plaque Ellsworth does. It burnt. It burnt sometime in the 80s, I think, and they rebuilt the church. Yeah. So I saw that. And then what was interesting was I wanted to go to Beloit Historical Society. I'm driving down the street corner, and there's like abandoned churches. And I get to this building. It's okay. It looks like a nice building, but the grass is all growing up in the curbing. And I had called early, 2 weeks before, and said, "Are you going to be open?" "Oh, yeah, we're open during the week." And then I look in, and I knock on the door. And I said, "I can't believe they're closed." I was just really upset. And all of a sudden, this face appears. "Hi, can I help you? I'm, dressed pretty nice." I said, "Yes, I'm from Colebrook, New Hampshire." "Yeah." And I just wondered if I could see the historical society. She looks at me and looks at my wife and says, "Sure, come on in." And I said, "Is there a reason you're closed?" "Oh, no." She said, "It's a really rough neighborhood now." And she said, and so this is the sad part, folks, right? So Colebrook is a part of that community. Let me tell you, I have pictures of it. I walk into this beautiful monumental. It's like a mini version of the Arc de Triomphe. But it's not that well kept. And there's a beautiful bronze plaque, and there's engraved in there a picture of Horace White and Horace White Jr. Now remember, Horace White Jr., if you listen to the story, Horace White Jr. became the editor of the Chicago Tribune. So very famous, very well known at the time. In 1904, they erected that as a memory. And to sit there in Beloit, Wisconsin, 1,100 miles away, and to read this plaque that says, from Horace White, who, what they founded the New England Emigrating Company, formed this to come from Colebrook, New Hampshire, and Horace White Jr., born in Colebrook, New Hampshire. I mean, to me, history is a neat thing, but just to stand there 1,000 miles away and say, wow, they actually founded this community.
If you get to go online, check out BeloitHistoricalSociety.org and look under physicians. And you'll find quite an interesting history that parallels what Ellsworth has written and mentions Colebrook quite a few times.
You had me talk about the Iron Horse. Well, I know I was the only person in the group here. The last train on the train tracks through Colebrook, I wrote an article for the Colebrook Chronicle, if you want to go look at it online, a few weeks ago in 1993-94. The last train came out it actually was the last engine. It was an abandoned engine up in Beecher Falls. They had pulled it down the tracks, and it was able under its own power to essentially make it from down the tracks through Colebrook. And I have a picture. I was standing on the tracks right in Colebrook by the old railroad station as the train came through, and that was it. That was the last train on the tracks. The tracks essentially from the old railroad station north have all been tore up, and it's now an ATV trail. That's what they use the rail bed for up to Stewartstown now.
I wanted to add something about Spiro Legoulis here very quickly. I think the name of that company, David, might have been the Necco costume company, something like that. And I'll tell you why, because Spiro was on the board of directors of the Necco Candy Company. Yeah. It was a very unusual company because they were members of the John Birch Society, for one thing. But it was a small company, and he was coming up to Colebrook, and he got great friends with Margaret Keach. Well, who wasn't friends with Margaret Keach? So he'd drop in her junk shop next door to my father's store, and she would take orders for these costumes, and he'd bring them up, and he'd bring them in my father's store, and then people would pick them up at the store for the bicentennials. And of course, my family came to Colebrook from Italy. And unfortunately, there was no Italian families to get into the ghetto with. The only ghetto was on Spring Street, French Canadian. So
until after the Bucciarelli children moved onto Colby Street near the Sambitos and the Cajulas, and people used to call it Guinea Corner.
That came later. But anyways, it was luckily they befriended the Parsons family, Marjorie Parsons, Dr. Parsons. So Gifford and Parsons, I grew up next door to them and their children. And I heard over and over and over again this connection between my family and the Parsons family. And really, the Parsons family mitigated or softened a lot of that prejudice. My grandmother talked about prejudice from certain families in Colebrook, and she started naming them off when she got old. I'll never repeat that.
Now that is dangerous. Terry, I trust she never mentioned the Hicks family.
I don't think she did. She did not. But you know, that, as with all things, immigrants assimilate, and they assimilated into the community quite well. So
I do remember after school going to your dad's store, always to buy my Archie comics and my potato chips and bubble gum.
Did you steal any candy in there, Renee?
Never.
Never?
I've,
Okay, good.
I have tried to make amends to you in the past already, Terry. Okay.
Terry, no comment.
No, I don't know if you're all aware of this or not, but this Colebrook, Our Hometown, which was produced by New Hampshire PBS, and you can access it online, or you can get it at the library, or you can get it. I have about a 7-minute thing on here that shows all the pictures of the store and the whole history of the Rosai family. All right.
Goodbye.
Wow.
Great to be with all of you. Fantastic.
Yes.
I wish we could all go to dinner at Sutton Place.